way, but.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thanks for sticking around for the last panel of the day. My name is Stano Kalubgia. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Tulane University, and I'm also the director of the Center for Public Policy Research. Really happy to have convened this panel of friends and housing experts, a very California-centric panel here, which is neat. I'm a former Californian, a 9-month New Orleanian. So to my right, I have Jenny Schuetz, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, Nolan Gray, who's the research director of California YIMBY, which is a pro-housing advocacy group in that state. Chris Elmendorf is the Martin Luther King Professor of Law at the UC Davis School of Law. And last but not least, Mike Manville, who's the professor and chair of the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. So I just wanted to kind of get right into things and start with you, Jenny. So in your book, Fixer Upper, available at fine retailers everywhere, you set out a set of criteria for how we can judge whether a city's housing policies are successful, right? Does supply respond to demand? Can buyers choose between a variety of affordable options? So based on this criteria, how are American cities doing by and large? And are there any common themes in what's going right and what's going wrong?
Yeah, that was sort of an attempt to set up some objective criteria that we can use to look across cities. And I'll give sort of two answers. One is how individual cities are doing, or metro areas are doing internally. And then the other question is, of course, that we have an open city model in this country. You're allowed to move across metros. And actually, part of the problems we're seeing now are not a reflection of an individual city or metro's problems, but sort of the spillover of all of California's problems to the rest of the country. We might as well just go ahead and put that out there. So starting with just like, is a housing market building enough units to accommodate the demand that comes from population growth and job growth? And that's one where pretty clearly we see that large parts of the country are failing on just like the most basic level, right? So like California hasn't built enough housing for 30, 40 years. Boston, New York, some of the other sort of classically constrained markets have been underbuilding for many, many decades. Are they building enough homes in the places that people want to live within those metro areas? And that one, I would say almost all of the metros kind of fall down. I did some kind of fun analysis looking at not just the supply constrained metros, but places like Dallas and places like Detroit, where the metro area is building plenty of housing, but if you look at the exclusive neighborhoods, they're not, right? So like the fancy suburbs of Dallas and Detroit are underbuilding just like the fancy suburbs of San Francisco and Boston. To what extent is the market offering a range of housing options, both at sort of, for rent and for sale, and different sizes and different kind of structure types to accommodate demand? And that's one where we also don't do especially well, both in kind of growing places and shrinking places. And actually, New Orleans is probably a good place to think about that. So, in some sense, there's more housing than needed in some neighborhoods. We also have a bunch of older homes that aren't in particularly good condition, maybe ought to be replaced. We're not replacing them. Across the country, actually, one of the sort of under-discussed problems is, we have shrinking household sizes, shrinking family sizes. We still keep building a lot of 4, 5, 6 bedroom, single-family detached homes for an aging population of 1- and 2-person households. And we have a lot of existing single-family homes that are occupied by 1- and 2-person households who don't even necessarily need or want that much space, but can't move to something else. So like there's a stickiness to the existing stock that we are not accounting for particularly well. And that's not inherent, right? I mean, we can look at cities where, I used to live in a brownstone in Harlem that had been built as a single family house, went through an iteration, I think, of nearly 20 essentially SROs. And by the time I got there, there were 8 separate apartments. But like we used to reconfigure existing structures to fit different housing sizes in a way that we don't really do systematically anymore. So sort of, in general, we're not doing great on most of these dimensions. But I would say what's become particularly apparent in the last maybe 4 years or so is that even the metro areas that used to be building enough housing to accommodate growth, right? The Nashvilles, the Austins, the places that built a ton of housing and are still building a lot of housing aren't building enough to keep up with the inflow of population, and particularly with the inflow of college-educated workers who are earning pretty high salaries and can outbid people. And this is, in fact, it's not just California, but it's kind of California, right? Like, Californians are moving to Salt Lake and to Nashville and to Austin, and they're bidding up prices because they can, taking their equity with them. And so the rest of the country is essentially suffering from the fact that the highest cost metros with some of the highest paid jobs, haven't been building enough to carry their fair share, and the rest of the country is now suffering from that.
We're working on it.
So that's actually a really good transition. So Nolan, you recently also published a book, Arbitrary Lines, about zoning, which is a critical tool of housing policy. And this panel is about barriers to production. Can you tell us, for folks in the audience who may not be familiar with the history of zoning and how it came to be, what is it? How did it come across? How did it come to be, and how did it catch on in America's cities?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks to the Murphy Institute for having us, and thanks, Stan, for reaching out. A few months ago, Stan messaged the three of us and said, you guys have solved housing affordability in California. Can you come to New Orleans and explain? No, I'm kidding. It's a real pleasure to be here. Right. In my book, I argue that zoning is not the entire part of the problem, but it is a major part of the problem in terms of building housing at scale in many of our communities. In simple terms, we take every single lot in every single one of our cities, and we assign a permitted land use and a permitted density for that lot. Now, I think most people are basically familiar with zoning. Anybody play SimCity, City Skylines growing up, right? Most people have some sort of pat narrative about, well, this is necessary to keep housing and factories separate from each other, et cetera. But part of why I wanted to write the book is that if you actually understand the origins of zoning, it really was a project of segregating our cities. That's baked into the logic of the system. It was a direct response to the Supreme Court overturning racial zoning in Buchanan v. Worley in 1917. So what cities do instead is they turn to class-based segregation, which of course we know has clear racial implications. And these aren't historical rules, these aren't historical codes. In almost every major American city today, the vast majority of residential areas, it will be illegal to build anything other than a detached single-family home. It's a project of segregation. It's a project. It's a social project. It's a vision of what one particular home, family, neighborhood should and shouldn't look like. And as we have more and more demand for housing within our cities, this has proven to be a big barrier. Another, I think, key part of the story, and this is important for our perspective at California YIMBY, where we advocate for a lot of state-level intervention, is that a lot of these policies were heavily, heavily promoted by the federal government and were written into law by state governments. So, I think historically we're used to thinking of this as, oh, this is the exclusive purview of local governments. Local governments have total authority over zoning. And many local cities use it well, but it's a state-delegated power, it's a federally promoted power, and we argue that at all levels of government we need interventions to liberalize these codes and make it easier to build infill housing.
Right on. So, Mike, a lot of your research deals with zoning and how land use regulation relates to housing prices. So what do we know about places that impose stricter constraints on what can be built and what can't be built, and what effect that has on housing prices? Do we know if there's a causal link between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I really appreciated the comment in the previous panel where someone said that we have a lot of data and we've learned a lot, but like if you really wanted to, you could just argue about this data forever, because this is the same sort of thing. This is not the type of question where you're going to get proof the same way we get, does the COVID vaccine work proof, does light bend when it goes around the back of the sun type of proof, right? So we have a big body of compelling evidence, right, that I think is plausibly causal, that says that places that have, with demand, that really strictly regulate their land use, they have higher housing prices. And they have those higher housing prices, maybe that comes in two forms. The first form is just a sheer quantity effect, right? If you were going to build 10 houses and then the zoning law constrains you to build one, that's less supply for any given amount of demand, and you have you're going to have a higher price. But what Jenny alluded to, which I think is really important, and Nolan as well, is that you also get these composition effects, right? When you say you have to put one house on a site that has a minimum size of a half acre, or when you say that you can't turn this big detached single-family home into 3 apartments, right? Or when you say that you can't have micro units, right? Then you deprive yourself of entry-level housing, and it doesn't have to be owner-occupied housing, but just housing for people who don't have a lot of money. There's going to be less money because it's smaller, and because there's shared amenities. And I think one thing we've sort of forgotten in the history of housing is that there was a time when there was no credit and people really didn't have a lot of money in this country. And we housed a lot of them because it really was legal to build housing of all different types of sizes and all different types of qualities. And what I mean by quality isn't just like it's falling apart. What I mean is it doesn't come with a bathroom. It doesn't come with a kitchen. You shared that. And that's, I think most of us in this room are very comfortable saying like, well, I wouldn't want to live in that, right? But if you live in Los Angeles, you come to realize like, well, for a lot of people, it's the choice of that or a tent. And it's better than a tent. Right, but the reason we don't have these single room occupancy hotels, these smaller units and so forth, is that in most places they're just simply illegal.
Interesting. So Chris, new housing and especially apartments get blocked a lot by zoning, but there's other tools that anti-housing actors have in their arsenal to prevent new homes from being built. And as a legal scholar, you study a bunch of them. Can you talk about how maybe delay gets weaponized against new housing and how processes like discretionary review and environmental lawsuits contribute to slowed housing production?
Sure. So the original theory of zoning, if you abstract from the underlying racist impulse, the original theory was we have this old common law doctrine called the law of nuisance. And the law of nuisance said one property owner can't use their property in such a way as to unreasonably interfere with neighboring property owners' use of their property, such as by, I don't know, like doing something really stinky with it. I mean, literally stinky. And the law of nuisance was super unclear. What does unreasonable use means? Well, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder or the eye of the neighbor. And as transportation costs fell and industrialization got underway, there were more conflicts among neighboring landowners. Some of those neighboring conflicts, many of them were due to racism, right? Because lower transportation costs enabled people to move into different neighborhoods where they weren't previously. But other those conflicts really were due to things like stinky land uses. And the proponents of zoning, in addition to having a racist agenda, had an agenda of like, let's make the law clear, right? Let's substitute these clear rules which we can spell out in advance for the old fuzzy indeterminate law of nuisances where somebody would build somebody and then a neighbor would sue them after the fact. And so the original zoning codes were written in such a way that if you wanted to, say, build apartments, if you went and got land, you bought land in the area zoned for apartments, maybe it wasn't much the city, but you could at least get your permit to build apartments if you were in the apartment zone. And over time, that notion that you could do as of right, just by delivering your plans, showing they complied with the rules, and getting a permit, you could do by right what was allowed under the zoning code, was whittled away. And it was whittled away through the establishment of what are sometimes called zoning overlays that say, well, yes, you're in a zone where apartments are allowed, but before you can build your apartment, you need to go through some design review and ensure the neighbors are cool with the design of your apartment. It was whittled away through the establishment of what are sometimes called conditional use permits, which say you can build an apartment in this zone, but only if you establish the satisfaction of some bureaucrat or planning commission that your apartments are in the public interest. And it was also whittled away through the establishment of more and more different clear rules, which once you layer them on top of one another, result in almost nothing being buildable anywhere unless you can get the rules waived. And then there would be a discretionary process for a waiver, which could be an administrative waiver, sometimes called a variance, or it could require going to the city council and say, would you please, in the exercise of your legislative discretion, change the zoning designation of my lot, because it turns out that once you put together the 6 or 7 different sets of different objective standards, I can't build anything. And there's been some work done recently looking at a lot of different California cities that suggests that at least apartments pretty much can't be built as of right anywhere. And it's not clear if that's true in the rest of the country. It may be that California is worse than the rest of the country, but as I think an earlier commentator spoke about the Wharton Residential Land Use Index, which suggests that rules are becoming more complex everywhere. So the bottom line is that to build denser housing forms, you usually need to get some kind of discretionary approval. And if you need a discretionary approval, you need to go through a public hearing usually, and at that public hearing, any neighbor who doesn't like your project can show up and object to it. And then there's a process of negotiation that goes on that's sort of coordinated by the city council between the developer and the neighbors. And maybe something gets built or maybe something doesn't, but it takes more time to do it. And usually someone has to be paid off or made happy. And time is money, right? If you're borrowing money on capital markets, which is what real estate developers do, and paying off neighbors is also money. So this makes development more expensive. And then finally, in some states, not all of them, but in more of the, sort of to stereotype a little bit, more of the democratic leaning states, you have environmental review requirements, which are typically triggered by the exercise of permitting discretion. So in California, for example, if there's any kind of local discretionary review, there's also a review required by the State Environmental Quality Act, which in turn provides a toehold for any third party to show up and not only complain to the city council, but also sue in state court and argue that there wasn't sufficient environmental review. And it turns out that this has been a really great device for people who or interests who have see an opportunity to extract some value from a project, maybe in the form of, say, a project labor agreement, a contract to pay above market wages for certain workers on the project. And they don't have any environmental objective at all, but they can use the threat of litigation and delay as their leverage to extract their piece of the pie.
So Jenny, when we talk about the housing crisis in the United States, we hear a lot of people talking about market rate housing and quote unquote affordable housing as distinct goods that are in competition with one another. Many elected officials you'll hear commonly say that we have enough market rate housing in our city, what we need is more affordable housing. So can you talk about the real distinction between the two, and what do we know about the production of market rate housing? What effect does it have on overall affordability in a city?
Yeah, it's a great question, and sort of getting into the weeds of definitions is sometimes actually helpful for the public conversation. So market rate housing, what we generally mean is housing that doesn't receive a direct subsidy, and I'm using direct very deliberately because all housing is actually subsidized, right? We have a lot of subsidies that go in the back door, so everybody gets a subsidy. The question is whether it's explicit or not. But market rate housing is one that's usually not income limited, so anybody in theory can afford to live in it if they can pay the rent or the mortgage, that doesn't get a direct subsidy. So that's most of the housing that we build, and virtually all of this is built by private for-profit developers, as is the homes that pretty much all of us live in, by the way. Affordable housing gets used actually in two different ways. So capital A affordable housing is housing that gets a direct subsidy. So something like the low-income housing tax credit, public housing. So something where there's an explicit federal subsidy and generally also comes with limits on the income of the people who are allowed to live there. We can also talk about lowercase affordable housing, which is unsubsidized but just cheap. So that's usually older, smaller homes that are lower cost to people who live in them but aren't explicitly subsidized. And those are not clear distinctions often in the public debate. So when the city council says we don't need more luxury housing, right? New construction for wealthy people, we need more affordable housing. What they really mean is housing that is cheap. It turns out, though, that new construction is just expensive to build because all the things that go into it are expensive. Land is expensive, materials are expensive, labor is expensive. And so new construction is going to be not affordable for poor people unless there's a subsidy. But also the existing housing is not super affordable, right? So a single family home on a half-acre lot is not affordable to most households either. So this winds up being very much a false dichotomy in the public debate. Often it's sort of, the luxury apartments and condos for the rich yuppies, that's bad housing that we don't want. And the 100% affordable housing for poor people, we do want. There isn't enough subsidy to build it, but the developers can just build it and, they can take less profits, right? The developers can be less greedy and build housing that's affordable to poor people if they chose to do it, but they choose not to. Which if you talk to like the nonprofits who build subsidized housing, they'll tell you actually that doesn't work either, right? The only way they can make it affordable is by getting a subsidy to do this. But there are a couple of ways that I think it's productive to think about the interactions. One is, if you don't build enough of the luxury condos and apartments for rich people, it's not like the rich people don't move to your city. They just pay more for the existing apartments and condos that are there and drive up the prices, right? And you'll often hear the analogy of musical chairs, right? The rich people get the homes that they want first, and everybody else sort of competes over the rest, and the poorest households get nothing, right? Because all of the homes are gone and there's just nothing available for them, right? So building more luxury housing, new construction for people who can afford to pay high rents and prices makes there be less competition for the older existing stuff and frees that up for poor households. The other is to think about the way that we provide subsidized housing. You can't build a LIHTC apartment building in a neighborhood where the zoning prohibits luxury apartments, right? Because the zoning is based on the structure. So if you can't build luxury apartments, you definitely cannot build subsidized apartments, especially in a discretionary world where, by the way, neighbors are even less excited about subsidized apartments than they are about luxury apartments. And we provide most of our housing subsidy through household-based vouchers, where people take the voucher and they go rent an apartment on the private market. Well, if you don't build enough apartments, then there aren't apartments available for people with vouchers. So if we want to make it easier for people with vouchers to find a place to live, and we want to make it easier to build subsidized apartments under LIHTC, then we have to change the rules to allow more apartments in general.
So, Mike, when we talk about deed-restricted affordable, what Jenny just called capital A affordable, or low-income housing, it's oftentimes more expensive to build one unit of that type of housing than it is to build so-called luxury market-rate housing. So, in your state of California, my old state of California, it's now common to find that one unit of deed-restricted affordable housing costs between $900,000 and $1 million to build. So how is this possible if we don't have things like gyms and pools and granite countertops in these apartments?
So there's two answers to that. I think one is just that the process by which we force mostly LIHTC developers to get their financing is extraordinarily difficult. It's very rare that someone would be able to build a medium or large-sized affordable housing development off one financing stream. Like they have to do, they talk about stacking their different subsidies, and that is just by itself an extremely costly endeavor. The other thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes these developments do have pools, and I mean, so it was stated earlier, and it's true that most of the research suggests that that if someone builds an affordable housing development in a neighborhood, it does not reduce the values in that neighborhood. And I think that research is accurate. It is important to remember that we prevent affordable housing from being built almost anywhere except in places that have sort of lower quality multifamily units already. And then on top of that, we often force those units to be amazing, right? If you would like to build a LIHTC affordable housing development in the city of Irvine, it has to have a junior Olympic pool. Right, and so that's why do they do that? Partly it's because they actually don't want these developments, and partly because there's just sort of this idea of like perfection based on moral proximity, right? Like that only the best in our community for these people, because they don't really think about the trade-off, which is like, well, you could probably have 20 more housing units, and so that's a big part of it. And then the only other thing I would add is that like it's absolutely correct that this debate is often framed as well, we could have these 100% affordable units, or we could have these luxury units, and it's also true that if you walked by two of these buildings on the street, you would not be able to tell them apart from the outside. But even more important is that the true luxury housing in any of these metropolitan areas, when we have that dichotomy, it sort of fades away. Right, because the LA Times every 3 years or so like goes into some new downtown building and they're like, this is the outrageous luxury housing they're building, and it's like, well, what makes it luxury housing? Well, there's a pool, there's a big shared pool, and there's this gleaming shared gym, and there's a dog run on the roof. It's this shared yard. And it's like, and that is all very fancy, and a lot of people can't afford it. But if you look at the typical detached single-family home, well, that has a private pool, and that has a private yard. And it probably has a Peloton and some weights in the basement that are a private gym, Like the real luxury housing is the single family home that we have just sort of taken and put in an entirely different category. And like that's fine, right? But if someone is in a kind of fancier vertical building, it's an affront to our equitable sensibilities. And I think that has been a very clever rhetorical trick for people who would prefer not to see more multifamily housing.
So Chris, aside from being a legal scholar who studies housing, you've also been a San Francisco resident for many years and are somewhat active in that city's housing politics, I guess we'd say. So San Francisco has a pretty robust system of requiring new market rate developments to include X% of units to be reserved for low-income households. And a lot of people might say this sounds good, right? It's affordable housing that doesn't cost the government a penny. But what's been San Francisco's actual experience with these so-called inclusionary zoning rules?
So that's a good question, and it's not just San Francisco's experience. It's an experience that many other places have had too. The original justification for, the pragmatic justification, I should say, for this requirement that any new development set aside some of the units as deed-restricted affordable housing was that developers are making so much money off their project that we can tax some of that money away without actually discouraging them from building at all. And the underlying model of what was happening, the mental model of what's happening, is something like this. A house sells in San Francisco for $1,000, but it only costs $500 to build. So there's that delta of $500, that difference that someone is taking to the bank. And if someone is taking that to the bank, shouldn't it be the public that's taking it to the bank? Like one way you, as the public, might try to take that money to the bank would be just to tax land and say, oh, well, if land is super valuable in these locations, let's put a tax on the land and then spend the money on schools or affordable housing or whatever else we want to do. But it turns out that land taxes are pretty politically unpopular, and in fact, in California, a close relative of the land tax, the property tax, was so unpopular that in the 1970s, the voters amended the state constitution to say basically you can't tax property, or you can't increase the taxes on property as the value goes up. And so inclusionary zoning is this kind of strange substitute that says, well, we're not going to directly tax the land. Instead, we're going to try to tax the development of the land through this in-kind transfer of housing units from the market to the subsidized or price-restricted affordable market. And if you get the inclusionary housing numbers exactly right, and if there are really extreme zoning or other constraints that have driven the price of housing way above the cost of building it, then it kind of works. But the problem is you got to get it exactly right. And getting it exactly right is virtually impossible. Why is it virtually impossible? Well, because it turns out that if you don't want to deter development through your inclusionary zoning tax, you need to vary the tax, that is the share of deed-restricted affordable units that are required, on like a parcel-by-parcel basis. Why? Because each parcel has some existing use, right? And that existing use sets in an existing, thriving city. That existing use sets some floor on the value of the parcel that's greater than like the value of the land for farming or whatever else you would do with it. And so any kind of tax, which is what inclusionary zoning is, on development is going to end up deterring development on some parcels, but maybe not on others if prices are high enough. And then finally, even if you think you got it about right, it turns out that if there's a supply shock or a demand shock that's adverse, and San Francisco has experienced both, like a negative supply shock in the sense of a supply shock that's driving up the cost of building through that's really being experienced everywhere, right, through commodity and construction material cost prices, and then a negative demand shock associated with COVID and the movement of people away from city cores into outlying suburban areas, then when you have those shocks coupled with the inclusionary and other requirements, then construction falls to zero.
Can I just add one quick thing
Yeah,
to that?
please, go ahead.
Which is just that even if you get it exactly right and nothing disturbs it, the problem with inclusionary zoning is that it's conditioned on the idea that most housing is very expensive.
Yeah.
That it only works if the market rate developer is taking advantage of rents that are so high that they would immiserate most people. And so it's fundamentally self-defeating. It accepts the idea that most rents are going to be crushingly high so that you can then produce a small amount of low-income housing and basically offer it in a lottery to some lucky people.
And I'll actually throw out, inclusionary zoning is one of our favorite topics, you can tell. I'll actually throw out two other limitations of it. One is if you think about the way we'd like to encourage a larger supply of below market rate housing, you'd actually want to be doing that in a counter-cyclical way, right? So we'd actually like to be, for instance, like local housing authorities or cities or land banks acquiring land when land is cheap and building when it's relatively inexpensive to build and not building at the peak of the market. Inclusionary zoning is by design a pro-cyclical project. You only get the affordable units when the market is producing, and you only get it where the market is building. So DC, where I live, has a pretty strict inclusionary zoning program, which has produced a lot of units, but it's only produced it in the neighborhoods where they're doing a ton of new development. Guess where they're not doing any new development? It's in the highest income neighborhoods. They build no additional housing, so you get no affordable units, and the affordable units wind up getting concentrated.
So Nolan, you currently work at California YIMBY, which is an organization that's dedicated to reforming housing policy on the state level. And that might seem odd to some people because housing policy traditionally in the United States is something that local governments mostly have jurisdiction over. So tell us a little bit more about this dynamic between state and local governments on housing. Why not just convince cities to do better?
Sure. Yeah. So just to level set a little bit here, because I think everything has to be said like 3 times, right? Mm-hmm. One of the major constraints on housing production in our country is we have a set of land use regulations at the local level, most importantly zoning, but also other regulations that I think we need to talk more about as a movement, that either prohibit housing production altogether, especially in the highest opportunity, most transit and job-rich areas, make the housing that can be built more expensive by requiring large lot sizes or requiring parking spaces that consumers wouldn't otherwise prefer, or if the housing's legal, and even if it's very expensive, subjecting it to a long discretionary entitlement process that's unpredictable and that falls hardest on projects that have an affordability component, where NIMBYs can mobilize and kill projects. We politicize every new housing development in this country to the detriment of the most affordable forms of housing. Okay, so everybody's sad now. The question is how you fix it, right? A unique feature of zoning and in the United States and a handful of other post-colonial English offshoots, including South Africa, I'll let you imagine why we have a fairly similar zoning system to South Africa, is that these powers are almost entirely local, right? So what we've done in the US is we've said to local governments, you got to write your own zoning code completely de novo. So within Los Angeles, metropolitan Los Angeles, which has 88 different jurisdictions, there are 88 different zoning codes that are almost entirely different. My life's work is zoning, and same with everybody on this stage, right? I couldn't actually speak with any authority on any given city's zoning code without probably spending a day or two reading it and talking to local experts, right? So we have this thicket of totally different zoning codes, and there is a lot of local reform happening, right? So you see really exciting local reforms in California in places like Emeryville in the Bay or San Diego, right? These cities are embracing reform. There is a local YIMBY pro-housing, pro-growth coalition that's reformed, and that's exciting. But the problem is, even many of those cases, they're surrounded by cities that are doing absolutely nothing. And we know that housing markets don't stop and start at jurisdictional boundaries, right? Another example, right? I was in Salt Lake City recently. Salt Lake City is doing a lot of really, really exciting reforms, but then every single suburb, and especially the most affluent, historically exclusionary suburbs, are doing absolutely nothing. And there's realistically never going to be a pro-housing coalition that can probably control a lot of those suburbs. So you have to do some of this stuff at the state level where state legislators are somewhat insulated from the local HOA president who can kill their election, maybe if they're a council member. That's one aspect of it, is shifting a lot of this policy to a level where we can actually get a broader picture of what housing policy should and shouldn't do. Another aspect of this is just putting guardrails around some of the most commonly abused powers, right? There are certain just best practices that we know we can scale up. There's really only kind of one way to legalize ADUs, right? We don't need hundreds of different ADU ordinances in every single state. One of the most successful things we've done in California, for example, is to say, okay, look, there's going to be one statewide framework for ADUs. Homeowners all across the state are allowed to add an additional rental unit in their garage or their basement or their attic. You can't charge them crazy high fees. You can't mandate loads of parking. You can't require owner occupancy. You can't do all these things that break this program, and it's going to be true everywhere, right? So part of what this does is this gets you liberalization in many contexts where it wasn't otherwise going to happen. It also gets you economies of scale, right? So again, part of why this reform has been so successful is that we now have a statewide 40 million person ADU economy. And so we're getting this ecosystem of small local builders who can build this stuff. That's why it's really important to do things at a larger scale rather than the way we've approached land use planning historically in an ad hoc way. That's not to diminish local reform. I mean, local reform in a big city can be hugely impactful. And I can say from a state advocacy perspective, it's enormously helpful to state advocates to be able to say, look, I was in Montana, and we were saying, hey, look, we think we should reduce minimum lot sizes statewide. And a few cities have already done it, and not only did the sky not fall, but I'll show you a picture of the townhouse. It's pretty, it's nice. There's a nice young family living in it. Is this really so bad? So in an ideal world, every local government sees the light and adopts these reforms, but I think, unfortunately, given the political reality of it, we're going to have state interventions, and I would add federal supports and subsidies and carrots and sticks.
So in this conference so far, and this question is directed to Mike, we've talked a lot about developers and governments and regular people just looking for somewhere to live, but we know that there's other actors involved in housing markets. So for instance, there's institutional investors like Blackstone that have been purchasing tens of thousands of housing units in markets across the United States, right? Here in New Orleans, we have an issue with many former rentals, especially in historically underprivileged neighborhoods being converted into Airbnbs and other types of short-term rentals. So if we need more supply to lower prices, what can be done about these entities that are just gobbling up large numbers of units and reducing supply?
Oh, thanks for that non-controversial question.
That's why we flew you out here, man.
I think that, and we deal with this in Los Angeles too, I think not quite to the extent as a proportion of the stock that you would see in New Orleans. I think that short-term rentals are a legitimate problem, right? I mean, if you have a situation where it becomes more profitable or the owner of a building comes to see it as more profitable to convert most of those units that were apartments into short-term rentals, that's a reduction in supply. And a reduction in supply is going to, all else equal, lead to higher prices. So that criticism of Airbnb, I think, is hard to argue with. And I think people have taken, to Nolan's point, there have been many different approaches to try and regulating short-term rentals. And I think the biggest problem that all of them face is just monitoring, right? That it's really hard to actually enforce this. That's not to say you shouldn't do it. But I also, I think when we look at places like New Orleans, when we look at places like Los Angeles, it's easy to blame the entire short-term rental problem on Airbnb, and I do think Airbnb dramatically expanded it, but it's important to remember that these are places that had a lot of short-term rentals before Airbnb as well, right? People used to come down here and rent a house for a couple days. So I think that you do want to work hard at trying to sort of, with the community, regulate the short-term rental, and people have adopted different ways to do it. But ultimately, I do think you also just have to say, it's got to be easier to build, right? That if you're going to lose some supply on the back end to hotels, or to sort of these short-term hotels, then you want to make sure that demand is accommodated through supply policies on the other side. I wish I had a better answer to that, but it's it's a tough one.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
So Jenny, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, the Airbnb question, there clearly are cities where that's a big part of the existing stock, right? So existing homes that get turned into basically full-time Airbnbs, and so it's a shift from, you know, a long-term home to a short-term
Right.
home. In at least some of the cities where that's going on, this is also clearly reflecting that they're not building enough hotels. I mean, at some level, like, these are actually substitutes for one another, right? So, like, New York City has an enormous market for people who want to come and visit and be tourists, and they have virtually a moratorium on building new hotels. What's going to happen? Do people not come to be tourists in New York, or did they just figure out a way to rent out the stuff that's there? I don't know if that's the same issue in New Orleans, right? We've seen this also in a number of, like, college towns where alumni want to have a condo that they come back for football weekends, and they're, you know, prepared to sort of leave it empty the rest of the time. So I think that the dynamics of where Airbnbs are a big part of the stock is a little bit different, but at some level thinking about, like, what are the substitutes, what's the incentive for a property owner to only, you know, if you can make enough renting out the property, you know, 4 times a year for home football weekends to cover your mortgage, well, why wouldn't you do that?
Can I jump in on this too?
Yeah, please.
Just two things that I think were surface or lurking around here. One is that, like, an Airbnb is a substitute for a second home, right? So if you ban Airbnbs, maybe you end up with more people who have a pied-à-terre in Los Angeles rather than, like, you know, renting an Airbnb. And it's way better that people be renting Airbnbs where they can effectively share their pied-à-terre than to have that unit just taken off the market because it's occupied. It's a pied-à-terre that's occupied, you know, a couple weeks out of the year. Second, I think there's maybe a difference between that we should be thinking about between short-term rentals or second homes and institutional investors who are in the long-term rental market, but who are moving into markets where previously rentals weren't part of the market at all. So I think a lot of the controversy around Wall Street or hedge fund investors buying up single-family homes is not out of concern that those single-family homes are going to be used as short-term rentals, but that they're going to be used as long-term rentals in neighborhoods where previously everything was owner-occupied. There really weren't long-term rentals. Right. And I actually think it's kind of potentially a very good thing for socioeconomic mobility and opportunity for the single-family home market to be open to tenants, not just to people who have the family resources or risk tolerance to become owners. But clearly there's also a lot of upset, and going after Wall Street or hedge fund type investors has become politically popular in both very Democratic leaning states like California and very Republican leaning states like Texas.
And all of this area, your BlackRocks, your Airbnbs, things like that, that's an area where a lot of more data needs to be brought to bear, because I think almost as soon as these arguments start, you start asking just basic questions. For instance, you know, what was this home going to be used for before? You know, who's moving into it? Where would they have lived otherwise? Or with respect to an Airbnb, how many days is the owner really using it as a short-term rental? And presumably the platforms know this, but nobody else really does. And the overall welfare implications of these interventions really do depend a lot on the answers to those questions.
Well, so this has been sort of a depressing conference. But despite all we've talked about today, there actually have been some major successes around the country in removing barriers to housing production and increasing affordability. So Nolan, I was wondering if you could tell us about some of these successes, and in particular about some of the bipartisan coalitions that have come together to reform housing policy around the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of the reason why I do this work is that I think a lot of progress is possible in the near term now. I mean, when I was in planning school, my land use law professor made a joke. He said 2 things are going to survive the nuclear apocalypse: cockroaches and single-family zoning. Okay, this was, I think, in 2016. Minimum parking requirements, same thing that Donald Schuetz at UCLA has done so much amazing work on. For years, the idea that we would touch these rules was unthinkable. And now it's almost unthinkable to not do anything on these issues. I mean, at a clip of, you know, almost every single day, everyone on this stage is getting calls from folks in the most random cities and states asking, what do we need to do? So there's a huge amount of opportunity here. And I would say in unconventional places, you know, and part of it, I think, is this bipartisan quality, right? Even in a deep blue state like California, we occasionally still need conservatives who get it to help us get bills through committees. And of course, in almost every other state in the country, you're going to have bipartisan support. One of the beautiful things of this issue is that I actually think it's less in an ideological or cultural corner than your typical issue. You don't really have to be fully bought into any ideological or partisan program to say, okay, here are a set of rules that are making our housing more expensive. Now, of course, the rhetoric that you might want to use on this issue is going to vary a lot. The folks in Montana, when they radically changed their statewide code, legalizing ADUs statewide, legalizing apartments in all commercial zones statewide, and very nearly reducing their minimum lot sizes statewide, they're talking about property rights. They're talking about deregulation. They're also talking about conserving their natural areas, right? My favorite line was, we need to end California-style zoning. Made it a little awkward for me to be there testifying as the California guy, but whatever you got to say it, right? In a place like the Bay Area or New York City, you might be talking about the racist and exclusionary origins of a lot of these rules. You might be talking about sustainable growth patterns. And neither of those angles is disingenuous. They're completely valid, but you speak in terms of people's values, and I think you'll be surprised by how much progress you can make. I almost think we're in a healthy place now where California and Texas, I think, are on this trajectory of like who can reform these rules the fastest, right? And I'm sorry to say Texas is starting from a pretty far lead in terms of allowing a lot more housing. So, I would just stress, this is why we do this work. And a lot of these things, not only are they not beyond the pale, but a lot of the reforms are now, by this point, proven, right? Like, parking requirements have been gone in American cities, and at least a handful of American cities, for the past 5 or 6 years. And not only did the sky not fall in places like Buffalo and Hartford, but a whole bunch of historic properties could be reused. A bunch of parking lots could be turned into apartments and shops. Minneapolis made history eliminating single-family zoning in 2019, and Minneapolis was the only city in their peer group that actually saw home prices fall in real terms over the course of the pandemic. And there's a lot of factors going on there, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the fact that they're also on this building boom tear of some missing middle, but also a lot of new apartments on their corridors and in transit-oriented areas was a key part of that story. We talk about Austin, right? Austin had incredible run-ups in home prices, but because they had a more liberal local land use regime, they had a building boom. And now, rents are falling, and the narrative around Austin is, oh no, the home prices are falling too quickly, right? Would LA be so lucky? It's proven, and there's real coalitions here. And so I would say, a key part of what's been successful for us is building these unconventional coalitions, activating people who historically weren't thinking about housing, talking in terms of their values, listening to how they think about these issues, and showing that to elected officials, and they respond.
Well, I want to leave some time at the end for questions, if there's anyone that has anything to ask our panel. I think Hoof's walking around with a microphone.
Well, have you asked a question? Not yet. All right, then you go,
Henry.
get your go. But I hold the mic.
All good. Hi, everyone. Yeah, all good. Question for the LA-based folks. I've been reading kind of the news coverage about ED1 out there, and it looks like it's off to a promising start. How's it playing out on the ground? Are there kind of NIMBY movements to repress it? And then also, is it an exportable policy? Because what it seems to do is pretty incredible from the news coverage I've seen.
You want to go?
I'll say, yeah, there are people trying to roll it back. The way that a reform was at least somewhat successful is that there are people trying to roll it back. The numbers get updated week to week. Last I checked, about 14,000 units have been entitled and I think permitted through it, right? To my mind, so for those who don't know, ED1 was the mayor's office saying, if it's a 100% deed-restricted affordable project, we are going to get it through the entitlement and permitting timeline as quickly as possible. This didn't require any change in underlying zoning. When coupled with state density bonus, a statewide framework that says if you build a certain number of units that are affordable, we'll give you a lot more density and we'll give you relief from all the typical setback rules and height limits and lot coverage rules that make the project infeasible. What I think ED1 reveals is there's incredibly low-hanging fruit to just getting your entitlement and permitting processes ironed out. If you can get a project from taking 6 months or 2 years down to 2 weeks or 48 hours, that's transformative. That's almost as valuable as some of the most radical zoning reforms. I talk about ADUs a lot. I think a big part of what was important for ADUs is that now if you're a homeowner, you don't have to hire an attorney, you don't have to hire a planner. You can go into your planning office, and in many California cities, you can get a permit in 48 hours. So bringing it back to ED1, I think it remains to be seen how many of those permitted projects ultimately get built. As I understand, many of them are dependent on finding voucher tenants, but we know we have a big backlog of voucher tenants. I hope it's made permanent and also expanded to single-family areas that were excluded from that. But Mike, I'm sure, has perspective.
I think that was a really good summary. I think I'm just going to, not to be a downer a little bit, but emphasize Nolan's last point that I'm going to feel a lot better when some of these break ground. There's whispers that go around the development community that a lot of these projects might just be vaporware. And I think because the big, it is absolutely the case that we should be streamlining affordable housing developments. But it is also the case that the binding constraint on these for a long time has been, do they have the money, whether it's the voucher-based tenants or the stack? And without sort of seeing a big change in the number of vouchers or the quality and quantity of that stack, I just find it hard to believe that we suddenly have the finances ready to go for so many of these projects. I would love it if it was true. And it is a good policy, right? Like, because the worst that happens is you have it in place, and so when the financing and the voucher tenants do arrive, you can do it. But I do worry a little bit that this huge surge is a little bit illusory.
And I'll just add that going back to sort of the question about, capital A affordable housing or lowercase affordable housing, like at the end of the day, we want more homes and we want homes to be cheaper. And so you could, the basic version of this, a city could choose to make the permitting process shorter and more transparent for all housing, not just, preference for subsidized housing, but like all of the new housing that gets built takes less time to do and so can be sold or rented at a lower price. Like, in a sense, that's a win for everybody. And so, why don't we just do that?
I'm not letting go.
Oh, sorry. Hi, folks. My name is Lucinda Flowers, and I, especially for a number of years post-Katrina, I was very involved in affordable housing advocacy here in New Orleans. And we had, in fact, the folks from Policy Link, who you probably, some of you from California know, were here, very involved in trying to get inclusionary zoning introduced here post-Katrina. I'll just say that it's been a long slog over many, many years, and is probably still, I'm not as involved now, but has been really an ongoing conversation. And a lot of it is perceptions. That's the problem, is people's perception of the term affordable housing and what inclusionary zoning means. And, you all have talked a lot about California, but I'd like to hear if anybody has sort of broader US perspectives on what has been done to allay some of the misperceptions about affordable housing and inclusionary zoning.
So I've done actually a fair amount of work on inclusionary zoning, not just in California. I will say that inclusionary is really a policy that's designed to work in very high-cost markets because it's taking advantage of the fact that the existing zoning limits supply, that it's expensive to build, and that there are some number of market rate tenants who are willing to cross-subsidize low-income households. So that is the market design for which inclusionary. I don't think that's probably what you have in most of New Orleans, maybe in some neighborhoods, right? But the places where it's built a bunch of units are some of the California markets, DC, New York, some of the Boston suburbs. And I will say also that the number of affordable housing units built through inclusionary is tiny in the vast majority of places that have it. In fact, close to zero in many places, and it's not actually a free project to the government. So in order to make sure that inclusionary produces affordable units, it requires dedicated staff time to do those negotiations, to track the projects, to work with the developer. So, I'm saying this as if I were in charge of the city and figuring out where to put my money, if inclusionary is going to be a big political lift, it's probably not going to generate that many units, and I would think about something else.
I know what you're saying, and I know the market has changed here, but I'm talking about perceptions.
There's been a lot of work about just people's perceptions of affordable housing, for sure, and I think there's just I don't think the answers to that work would surprise anyone, right? There's strong associations of race and class, which are just strongly overdetermined, when people think about affordable housing development. And there's been some research that I think, this is why you occasionally get this sort of semantic treadmill where people are like, well, it's actually workforce housing, or they don't want to say affordable housing. And those strategies work until like the first meeting where someone's like, this looks like affordable housing. And then the whole, everybody turns against it.
There's just sort of somewhat related. There was a study that was done a couple of years ago by Raj Chetty and co-authors that looked at counseling programs for tenants and landlords on use of housing choice vouchers. And the counseling programs were fairly expensive, but the size of the treatment effect in terms of people's ability to get to use their vouchers in high opportunity neighborhoods was unbelievably huge. So that suggests that there's some way, at least if you're trying not to like change the views of neighbors about some yet to be built in the future affordable housing project, but changing the views of landlords about the benefits and costs of renting to a housing choice voucher tenant, that you actually can make a big difference with educational programs.
And I think just to go back to the previous question, the example of ED1, I think, is probably the most promising answer to this dilemma, which is just like, if you make affordable housing by right, it actually doesn't matter what people near it think. Because I think people say, oh, it's impossible, but for a long time, this is how we built housing. Like, no one has ever really liked the idea of housing going in near them, right? It's just we're not wired that way. But for a long time in the United States, people would be like, I don't like this new development. And people would be like, yeah, tough, right? And I think, we don't want to go all the way back to that, but I mean, I think we could go back in that direction. Because the other thing we know about housing developments is that, like, you could walk down streets in almost any city and point to a house that right now, or a housing development, is totally unremarkable. And if you knew its history, it'd be like, people hated that when it was proposed, right? I mean, you just have to get through that initial kind of fear of change. And then people forget, and they worry about something else.
I think one of the earlier sessions today was talking about some of the surveys that, everybody in a survey says that they're in favor of more housing and often even in favor of affordable housing. They just don't want it in our neighborhood. But we actually don't have small scale surveys in individual cities that much. We're starting to get a little bit of this, but part of changing, whose mind is it that you need to change, right? In some level, to get a policy change, you need the mayor and you need 50% plus one of the city council or the county supervisors, right? That's a finite number of people. What changes elected officials' minds? Knowing that their constituents are going to re-elect them the next time they run for office. And so in a sense, if you can get a survey, not of the people who are going to show up at the community meeting and protest against it, right? The 5 people who are really angry on a Tuesday night, but it turns out that a majority of your voters think this is fine. If you can get that kind of data and show it to your elected officials, they're like, oh, most people are actually okay streamlining the development process. That's something I can push through, and it's actually not going to be controversial with the general voter base. That is really effective information.
All right, folks, here we have 1 minute and 49 seconds. Last question.
Is Houston better, and is the goal to be more like Houston?
Yeah. I don't know the politics of that with respect to New Orleans, so I'm going to be careful. I thought you guys liked each other. Look, Houston has probably one of the most liberal regulatory frameworks on land use in the country. To the extent that they did not adopt a citywide system of segregating every single parcel on the basis of use and density, I think that's a non-negligible factor for why they're one of the most affordable cities in the country. Now, of course, Houston's not an all-purpose planning model. Houston made basically every other planning mistake that every other major American city made, and then some, over the course of the 20th century. But to the extent that they never adopted this citywide framework of the government's going to come in and assign where the apartments are allowed and where they aren't, I think, or where you can open a business and where you can't. These detailed rules that so many other cities have adopted, they're in a really good position. And I would say it's not just that, but it's things that they've done in recent years. So, for example, a lot of cities are struggling with a basically total lack of new starter home supply. Maybe you don't like the term starter home. Let's think of it as inherently affordable single-family attached or detached homes, okay? Until 1998, Houston had a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet. In 1998, they realized, wow, young professionals, retirees, different types of folks are not able to afford a home in Houston anymore if we're on this current trajectory, they reduced the minimum lot size down to 1,400 square feet. That was a change that cost city government nothing, and it, over the course of the past 25 or so years, facilitated the construction of, I think, 82,000 new townhouses and small lot single-family homes. That's a really valuable model. You know, when I talk to folks, I do say, yeah, you can learn that lesson. And sometimes I'll give the example of Houston when I'm speaking to audiences in California, and they're revolted by the idea that they can learn anything from Houston. But if you look at the data, middle class, working class people, families of color, they're not moving from Houston to LA. They're moving the other way. And it all gets down to this housing affordability and this housing abundance piece. And I think there's valuable lessons to be learned there. Again, not an all-purpose planning model, but certainly a liberal regulatory framework has kept Houston affordable.
Let me step in here and thank our panelists and say that this has been really, really informative. So first off, thank you.
It's so good. Holy shit, that's so
Secondly, I need to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. We're going to have a reception right after this, so you'll be able to ask more questions because they're not leaving. However, before anybody, no, they're not leaving. I'm going to block the door. However, before we do anything else, I need to acknowledge publicly the people who made this possible, and I can guarantee it was not me. It is the Murphy staff, and they're going to be shy, so I'm going to call them out by name. That's my Murphy staff back there. The people who make this happen, I want to thank them. Before you leave, please, you thank them. They did all of the hard work in the planning for this. So hang around for the reception, and I want to really thank all of you for your insightful questions and for the insights that came from the panel. So thank you all, and that's what I said. I said reception. I know I said reception. That's close enough. Where's the reception? All right, first floor reception. See, this is why you have good staff. All right, thank you, everybody.
Y'all, thanks so much.